my name is Evan Frendo. In this session, we're going to look at evaluation. I've divided the session into 5 parts, really. First, we'll look at evaluation and discuss what we mean by this word and why we actually want to do it. And then we'll look at different things. We'll look at types of evaluation. We'll look at testing, which is a very common form of evaluation in business English teaching. We'll look at criteria which we can use in those tests, and then we'll have a quick finish on the corporate context, the training context which we find in companies. So what is evaluation? Well, basically it's very simple. We're using some sort of data, we're collecting some sort of information in order to make a judgment about how effective something is. So we might be looking at the needs analysis process in the English training, in the business English training, and making a judgment about how good we were at doing a needs analysis. We could be judging the course design. We could be judging the course materials, a very common form of evaluation. We could be looking at the quality of the trainer in terms of qualifications, in terms of experience, in terms of ability to manage a class and so on. We could be looking at the approach we're taking in the classroom or the methodology. We could be looking at how effective the learning actually is, and this is something we often do with tests. And we could actually be evaluating individual activities and tasks within the classroom. And we have a range of ways of doing this. Questionnaires, online, we can have focus groups, interviews, we can have face-to-face interviews, we can have online interviews, we can observe what's happening in the workplace, or we can observe what's happening in the classroom. We can do work shadowing to see how our training has changed people's behavior in the workplace. Of course, many types of tests. We can even ask people to do self-evaluation. So why do we want to do this? Why do we want to go through all this work? And it is a lot of work. Well, basically, there's lots and lots of reasons, but the 3 main ones, as far as we're concerned, are that we really want to make sure that the aims of the training have been met. We have an agreement with the course sponsors or the stakeholders to do something in the training, to use the materials in a certain way, and we want to make sure that those aims have been met. We might be looking to make improvements. We might know there's something which can be improved in a course, or we might just be looking at a course and discovering that there are improvements to be made. That's an evaluation. And in companies, especially in companies, we're looking to check if we're getting value for money. We'll look into that in a bit more detail later. So what types of evaluation are there in business English teaching? Well, we can come at this from so many perspectives and so many angles, but very often when you start reading about evaluation in English language teaching, in business English teaching, you come across these 3 words: summative evaluation, formative evaluation, and illuminative evaluation. Let's look what the 3 words mean and how they're different. Summative evaluation is basically a summary. So the focus is on the outcome. The focus is on the end of the training, the end of the use of whatever it is, the end of the classroom task, and we're trying to give it a grade or a number or something like that. There's very little discussion about how you got the grade, perhaps. It's just, did you pass, did you fail? You got 75% in the test, that sort of thing. So it's a summary, a quick summary of what's happened. Formative evaluation is quite different. This is where you're looking at the teaching process, the learning process as it goes on, and trying to make improvements. So you're getting discussions with the learners, perhaps, you're getting feedback from different sources, and you're changing things as the process carries on. Very different to summative, which is at the end. Formative is during the process, and the idea is to try and make improvements. Typically in business English teaching, formative evaluation is done by people in the classroom. Very often the trainer is the trigger for formative evaluation, and it's just a way of improving what is happening. Illuminative evaluation is different. It can be formative. We're also exploring the process. It's like putting a light on the process, but we're doing it from outside normally. So this is not the teacher inside the classroom, but it might be somebody coming in from outside, looking at the whole training course, visiting the classroom and so on. And what the aim here is just to have a look, to observe, to ask questions, to analyze what's going on, and then deal with whatever comes out of that analysis. So it's a form of evaluation which isn't um, predetermined beforehand. The purpose is not fixed. You don't go in and say, we want to make improvements. What you're doing is you're evaluating the effectiveness of something. Improvements might be one result, but we don't know until after the observation, inquiry, and analysis cycle has taken place. So let's look at tests. Tests are very common in language teaching, in any education context, and especially so in business English teaching, especially high stakes tests where people have to pass a test in order to get a promotion, in order to get a job, in order to apply for a job, and so on. And there are lots and lots of tests. Why do we do tests? Well, one of the main reasons is to place people. So teachers, trainers will do some sort of test in order to place people in the right class at the right level. So this is a placement test, and very often it's some sort of general test produced maybe by one of the big publishers or one of the big testing organizations, and it gives information about the level of a person, the proficiency of a person, and then you can put them into the right course. Of course, within a company, a placement test might have to do with the communication skills they have to use in the real world. It could be anything. Achievement tests simply check or test what has been achieved during a training course. What are they able to do which they couldn't do beforehand? A diagnostic test is very common in business English teaching. This is where you diagnose where possible problems are, where possible gaps are, where possible lack of skills or lack of knowledge might affect the ability of somebody to do their job properly. And so a diagnostic test is really having a look at where they need to be and then comparing it with where they are now and diagnosing where the problems are, where the gap is and where the course has to go. A progress test, very common in a long course which takes place over weeks or months. Progress tests are just tests at regular intervals to see how people are getting on and if the course is progressing at the right speed, if it's too fast, if it's too slow, and so on. And finally, there are proficiency tests. Proficiency tests are basically a look at a person's language competence and getting some sort of idea about how proficient they are, how good they are at using that language in particular contexts. So tests are always specific to a particular context. A local test in a university business English classroom will be quite different to a test in a company classroom, which will be probably quite different to a test of a group of adult language learners in say a language school. So it's specific to a group of learners, and they have a specific purpose. And there we've seen the 5 main purposes that language teachers normally refer to. If we look at test types, we really have 2 types. The first one is language testing as discrete point items. This means that we're looking at vocabulary items, grammatical structures. It's very decontextualized, and we're looking at one element of language and seeing if somebody can deal with it. So this might be something like, here's a word, what's the meaning? Match it to the meaning, and so on. So very, very simple, and very easy to mark, very easy to grade because it's right or wrong generally, but it's decontextualized. So it gives you an idea about somebody's ability to use elements in the language, but it doesn't give you an idea about how they can communicate in a particular context. And so at the other end of this continuum, we have task-based or performance-based assessment. This is very context-specific, and what we're looking at is giving people tasks which replicate or which simulate the tasks they have to do in real life, and then seeing if they can do it and where any problems are. Of course, in the middle, there are all sorts of things. At one end is the discrete point items, which is one element of language. The other end is much more complex. It's the whole communicative skills in a particular context. But in the middle, we have a range of things. For example, a dictation would be somewhere in the middle. It's not task-based, but it's not really discrete point items because we're looking at different communication skills while we do a dictation. Same with a close test or a gap fill. That's not discrete point items, but it's not task-based. It's somewhere in the middle. In business English, we very often look at task-based assessment in the corporate training context because, of course, people want to be able to know if they can do the tasks they have to do in the workplace. They're not worried about a theoretical language ability or ability to recognize a certain, to do grammar or to do vocabulary, etc. So when we're looking at tests, one of the things we really have to think carefully about is the evaluation criteria. What are criteria? Well, basically a criterion, so criteria is the plural, is a standard or a benchmark which we use to judge something. It's basically the measure of success. So it's a way to measure how good something is, how effective something is. In language teaching, very often it's about level of performance in a particular area. So if we look at discrete point testing, what we're looking at is related to one language element. If we're looking at task-based assessment, we're relating it to real-world performance criteria. And here you can see discrete point items related to one element, task-based real-world performance. And those are the criteria. Let's look at some criteria in a real-world task, just to see the sorts of things we might be interested in. A very common type of assessment might be, can this person give a presentation or not? And so we might be looking at these sorts of criteria: aims, structure, content, delivery, visual aids, rapport, question handling, and timing. Some of those are language skills. Ability to handle questions might have to do with grammatical structures of how to deal with questions and how to understand what's going on. Some of it, like content, is very specific to the workplace context. So a business person going into a presentation might give a fantastic presentation with perfect aims, structure, delivery, and everything else. But if the content isn't there, then the presentation doesn't work. So you need to weigh these different criteria and give more detail about the criteria depending on the particular context. Another criteria list we might make is criteria for a good lesson. What makes a good lesson? What would you look at in a good lesson or in a lesson to make sure that it's effective? Pause the video here and just make some notes. That's the question. What are the criteria for a good lesson? Okay, so I hope you had a chance to make a list. You probably had to think a little bit about it, and you probably had to think about which perspective and which way you're going to look at this, because of course there are so many ways of judging how good a lesson is or what makes a good lesson. You might have something like you have clear aims and objectives. You might have something saying that there's a good mix of activities and tasks. It's not all one thing. You might say in a business English context that it's relevant to real world needs. You might want to look at the engagement of the learners. You might want to say, well, a good lesson has time for reflection. It's not only just intense activities and talking, but it might need some 5 minutes at the end perhaps to reflect on what's gone on. That's what one trainer might say. But if we look at another trainer, the list might be completely different. This list might be closer to your list. Trainer number 2 might decide that a good lesson has tasks related to the agreed objectives. The tasks have very clear instructions, so everybody knows what they're doing. There's useful feedback from the trainer and from the people in the class to the persons giving the task, so there's peer feedback as well as trainer feedback. A good lesson should have good pacing and lesson flow, so it shouldn't just be one monotonous, boring thing, but lots of different things and changing the pace occasionally. And it should have a positive atmosphere. And you can see that these criteria are quite different to the other criteria. So the problem with evaluation is shown quite clearly here, or one of the problems with evaluation. Depending on the criteria, you might get quite different results. And how you define the criteria will also give you perhaps different results. So what do we do when we go into the companies? What do we do in corporate language training that's different from evaluation in a language school or evaluation in a perhaps in a tertiary education context in a university? Well, of course, the basic idea is the same. We're still trying to make judgments about the effectiveness of things. But in corporate training, you're relating it to costs normally. And Donald Kirkpatrick came up with a very, very useful framework, which is used in companies all over the world and has been for decades now. So this is very well known to HR departments, to training managers, and so on. And if you're a business English teacher, you should be aware perhaps of this perspective of what a company might be looking at in terms of course evaluation. Um, and there are four levels in this framework. The first level, Kirkpatrick says, is let's look at the reaction of the participants. In other words, we've done a training course. Are the participants happy with the course? Are they not happy? And you can ask all sorts of questions to decide what makes them happy and what doesn't make them happy. These are the typical feedback sheets you find at the end of a course, where the trainer or the department hands out um, questionnaires to the participants, and everybody has to fill in and give some feedback. Of course, there's lots of ways of doing this. You don't have to do it written. You can do it in plenary, so the whole group together discussing what they liked and what they didn't like about a particular course or a particular task or a particular set of materials. There are many ways of gauging, trying to assess the reaction of the participants. Kirkpatrick then moves on to level 2 and says, here we're looking at what learning took place. And this is something we're very familiar with in language teaching. This is the testing part of an evaluation process. And what we're saying is we need to have some pre-testing, in other words, some sort of baseline study to make sure we know where they are at the beginning. And then post-testing at the end, the summative testing we talked about earlier. And that gives us an idea of what has actually been learnt during the course. If nothing's been learnt, or if the tests grades are lower than the starting point, then perhaps there are problems you should be looking at. Level 3 is about behavior. In other words, it's not enough to say these people can get a good grade in a test, but does this transfer to the workplace? Has their behavior changed when they go back into their normal jobs? So, for example, if you're doing a presentation skill class or a negotiation skill class, something like that, which is directly related to the workplace, are they able to bring what they've learned in the classroom into the workplace and hopefully do a better job? This gets tricky because how do you measure this transfer? Testing is relatively simple and we've got lots of tools to do it. Behavior, measurement of behavior and changes in behavior is actually quite tricky and depends on all sorts of things like interviews with line managers, interviews with the participants themselves, 1 month after the course, 6 months after the course, and so on. This is not the place to go into this in great detail, but you can hopefully begin to sense that it's actually quite a tricky thing to measure. And then finally, in a company, we will probably be looking at the results, or we'll be interested in the results of the training. In other words, okay, so these people have done a course in negotiations. Has that actually affected the bottom line of the company? Has the person's ability to work become better so that it has a direct influence on the business, a measurable effect on the business? Has the business as a company, as a corporation, benefited from the training in any way? It's perfectly good to send people in on an English course, but if they never use their English, or they use their English, but it doesn't actually make any difference to their meetings with their suppliers and customers, then perhaps this level of analysis will give you some guidance there. Now, of course, when we go into a company, one of the things which they discuss in this results part, especially, but after the results, after trying to measure the results, is what is my return on investment? In other words, I have put X thousand dollars, euros, whatever, into this training. What's my return for that? What am I getting back? That allows me to make a judgment as to whether or not it was value for money, whether or not it was a good thing to put my money into, or should I have put my money into some other investment? And most companies will look at return on investment and compare it to investments in other areas and see which one gives them the best return. So to do this, we have to really list the benefits. And in language training, there are so many benefits, and I'm sure you are aware of many of the benefits. It depends on the context, of course. Here are a couple I wrote down. Of course, language skills training normally results in improved communication skills, which for a company is very good. It means you can talk to your customer better, you can talk to your suppliers better, you can talk to colleagues in other departments, in other countries better. So the whole communication, level of communication has improved after the language training. Another benefit is, as you're learning a foreign language, especially in business English training, where it's tied very often into this intercultural aspect, we're increasing people's awareness of the intercultural communication process, increasing people's understanding of how to work with people who come from a different language background, a different culture, corporate culture, a different national culture, a different professional culture, and so on. So language training here might help, or business English training here might help our learners or the employees of a company better understand other people's perspectives, which is only a good thing. In a company, if you've trained people in languages, the workforce is more flexible. So instead of having only one manager you can send to XYZ country because they speak English, now you've got 10 people you can possibly choose from. So you don't have to worry so much. You're not constrained to only one or two people who can speak English. You've trained your workforce, you've trained other employees, so you're more flexible in how you can manage the workforce and react to business situations. And of course, there's lots of benefits for employees. One clear benefit is people's confidence grows as they are able to do their jobs better because they can communicate better. These things are hard to measure, but they are benefits. If we look at some of the costs involved in language training, of course, there's the training cost. There's the cost of the rooms you've used, the materials, the trainer, paying the language school to do a needs analysis, whatever. But these tend to be quite a small cost, funnily enough. The bigger costs come in things like opportunity costs. These are the costs that somebody has where if somebody's on a training course, they don't have the opportunity to do their own job. So you've taken them out from their job. So they've lost the opportunity. That's a cost to the company if they're not available to do their job. Another cost they might look at is waiting costs. For example, if you have a new market and you need language training to handle this new market, and the course takes 6 months, then those waiting costs incurred in those 6 months because you can't actually start your business because you haven't got the communication skills might be a cost to the company. Again, something you might want to calculate. And another very common cost is interference costs. For example, if you have a manager in a department and the manager is coming to your English training, perhaps a day-long seminar or 3 days in a hotel, or even 2 hours on Tuesday afternoons, they're not available to talk to their colleagues, to manage their departments and so on. So the language training has interfered with their ability to do their job. This is different to opportunity costs, but it's also a cost which people might want to take into account. Now, what a company might do is try and have an understanding of these different benefits and different costs, perhaps try and put a value on them, although these are very difficult because many of these costs, especially the benefits, but also the costs, are intangible. You can't actually put a number on, but you can make a judgment about whether or not the benefits of the business English training is paying or balancing out the costs which you have incurred because of the language training. These are things which every trainer needs to be aware. Any corporate language trainer, if you're working in a company, these are things you will be discussing with the training department, with training managers, with line managers who have to pay for these things sometimes. And so there's something you need to think about. So that brings us to the end of our very short video on evaluation. You can see it's quite a complex process. We've looked at these whole areas. First, we looked at what is evaluation. We said it's about judging effectiveness of something, and we said we might do it just to check that the aims have been met, to look for improvements, or to check for value for money. We then looked at types of evaluation, and I said that summative, formative, and illuminative are very common ways of thinking about evaluation and different ways of doing evaluation in a business English training context. We looked at language tests. We looked at purpose of language tests. So things like diagnostic tests or placement tests or proficiency tests, very different purposes. And we looked at types of tests ranging on a continuum from discrete point items, which is focusing on one element of language, right across to task-based or performance-based assessment, which is getting people to do what they have to do in the real world and then checking if they can do it. We looked at some of the issues to do with criteria and looked at criteria in terms of a standard or a way of measuring those tasks which we're asking people to do in the training room. And finally, we looked at corporate training. We looked at Kirkpatrick's framework, 4 levels, remember, which gives you a very different feel at each level of how the training has happened, how the training has affected the workplace, the results on the workplace. And we looked at balancing benefits and costs and trying to get an understanding or a calculation of the return on investment, which a company might be very interested in. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you found this useful. See you next time. Bye-bye.